Rolling Stone magazine printed a series of photographs that they found in the National Archives. And one of the photographs was of a Marine. It was signed, it was dated, Nicaragua, 1933, and this Marine was holding the head of a decapitated Nicaraguan who dared to fight against the Marines. And on the back, it was handwritten, "I don't think this photo should be made public." Censorship on a government level, which happens a lot. So once I saw that photograph in Rolling Stone, I put that into the slideshow. Well, that pair was the first pair they asked me to remove. So, all right, I removed it. The second set they asked me to remove was even more horrific because it was only a few months old. So this was 1986, I think it was the summer of 1985, a US college student decided to spend his summer vacation traveling around with the Contras. The Contras that's a short term for counter-revolutionaries. They were a mercenary army that the US government under Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, illegally, because Congress forbade any US money to support the Contras. So this is all illegal. But Ronald Reagan was determined to overthrow the Nicaraguan revolution, so he was illegally supporting the Contras to illegally overthrow the Sandinistas. So this college student was taking photographs of his summer with the Contras. And one of the things he took was they captured a militia, Sandinista militia. He's digging his own grave. He lies in the grave. And then one of the Contras slits his throat. And this college student is taking color pictures of this whole thing. Then he comes back to the United States and decides, I can make some money off of this. So it's really interesting. Is he there to support the Contras or to get his 15 minutes of fame, or both? Time magazine publishes those photographs, and I took my slides from Time magazine. That was the second set that got removed. And when you think of the kind of violence that kids see on TV, in film, it was kind of, blew my mind that real violence done in the name of, Ronald Reagan is too much for them to take. But the fantasy violence is, why not? So that was kind of real irony. So then after the third talk of the day, the teacher who invited me called me into the office. He was very apologetic. And of course I knew what was happening. He says, I was not to come back the next day. So, I leave. And turns out what I didn't know, that there had been, there were a few things I didn't know. One, it was in the middle of the military-industrial complex. It was within a very short drive of El Toro Marine Base, Camp Pendleton, Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, Miramar Naval Station, plus all the companies that manufacture weapons. So these kids were all the kids of either soldiers or the military-industrial complex. And about a month or two before, there had been some, and I don't remember exactly, but I think it was something to do with sex education, and they got furious that they was having, sex education in the high school. So they got very organized, and apparently when they heard I was coming to talk about the Nicaraguan Revolution, they pre-organized. So I didn't know any of this. And it was all coordinated. After I gave the very first talk, the kids, no cell phones, it was all, you find a payphone and you make a call, but they all had planned it. And they all called their parents, and they all called the newspaper, and they all were making complaints that there was a communist speaking in the campus. So I go home, I'm not really thinking of it. All of a sudden, I get a phone call from the Orange County Register, which is not necessarily known as your, bastion of liberal perspective. But it's a newspaper, and free speech is an issue with the newspapers. So they were the first ones who told me that I was being called a communist, and I was, all this stuff, and they wanted to know my opinion about it. So it ended up, they did me a favor, because far more people read about this issue in the newspaper than the, few hundred people that would have seen me at the school. So that was kind of backfired on them a little bit. Another instance was in 1992, we did an exhibit called, and this was the quincentennial, 500th anniversary of the European arrival, and we did an exhibit called 1492 to 1992, 500 years since Columbus, the legacy continues. And of course, the legacy of racism and exploitation and US imperialism and dominance, and that was, and the exhibit wasn't really against Columbus, it was against the European, what the Europeans did when they arrived. And it basically talked about US relations with as many countries in Central and South America and the Caribbean as I could, I had posters. So it's a way of showing what's happened in the last, 500 years. Well, and it traveled all over the country. You even went to Arkansas, It was a real popular exhibit, and then it goes to USC. And it was sponsored by the Chicano Studies. Now, the place they put the exhibit, we'd actually had an exhibit in the late 80s. This was in the early 90s, but we had an exhibit. They had a beautiful bookstore, glass-covered walls of a bookstore. And in the late 90s, we did an exhibit there against apartheid. Never had any problems, nobody complained, there were posters inside and outside. So even when the bookstore was closed, you could actually see some of the posters dealing with apartheid. So this was a real public space, probably one of the most public spaces you can imagine on a college campus. So we did the 500 Years show there. Well, one of the board of trustees was of Italian descent, and he took personal offense that Columbus was in the title, and it seemed to be, against Columbus. So the exhibit was taken down after a week. And then the rule went down, no exhibits can go here ever again. So this is really kind of uncomfortable, I tend to close doors in many ways, but if you don't push the buttons, you don't know where the limits are. City of West Hollywood asked us to do an AIDS exhibit in their lobby, and I showed them what I wanted to put up, and they said fine, and then some of them came down because they were a little too graphic. But the most, I guess, one of the more difficult acts of censorship that I've experienced really involved television. In 2001, so before September 11th, I had been invited to speak on a cable TV show. Bill Rosendahl is now a city council person from the city of LA. Actually, he represents my district of Venice. And I had been invited, he did a lot of community stuff, and I had been invited to talk about the center, just kind of generic, the center. And I was supposed to go on the end of September. Well, obviously, 2 weeks before I was supposed to go on, September 11th happened, and they asked me if it was okay to postpone. I said, please, you're doing me a favor to postpone. I'm not ready to go on this yet. And then they postponed it for, I don't remember, it was a couple of months. It wasn't a huge postponement. And then I called them up and I said, instead of doing a generic presentation on the center, I really want to deal with the aftermath of September 11th. And they said, fine. And I don't like to surprise people. I like to tell them what they're going to get, because that's just my style. So I said, I want to show posters that are done for the really 40 years since the Vietnam War that are using flags to protest US foreign policy, because all the flags you see now, where they first started out as a sign of grief and solidarity, really quickly became jingoistic, bomb them to hell, smash them. You've probably seen the flags, the posters that these colors don't run, very aggressive. And I wanted to show posters that use the flag, but in an anti-war way. And they said, fine. So I brought, and they wanted me to bring them ahead of time so they could photograph them so they'd be ready for the show. So I remember I brought them on a Wednesday. The show is happening on a Friday. So I bring, I don't know how many posters I brought, maybe 15. And there were some really mild ones, like green and white, the US flag, but in green and white. It was like an ecology flag, and it said Earth First. And some of them were really strong, like a very famous Fluxus poster by George Maciunas that says, you know, the U.S. leads all countries in genocide, and it gives statistics of how many, you know, Europeans and Jews the Nazis killed, and how many Kublai Khan killed, and how many, you know, Native Americans the U.S. killed, and, you know, it just kind of was this, you know, clearly one of the strongest posters. So it was an assortment. I'm walking out literally, I'm about to walk out the door on the Friday to go to the studio. I had my hair done, I was all set. And the phone rings. And it was the studio saying, you have a choice. You can either come on now without any posters at all, no graphics, or you can reschedule for another time with different posters. So I was really, you know, I was really set to go. I said, there's no way we can't get any of the posters on, because, you know, I didn't need 15 if I had 4 or 5. So they picked a couple, and there was one more I really, really wanted, you know, pushing. And so it was a Shirley Chisholm quote, and I don't remember exactly what it said, about something about, you know, setting a good example. You know, if you want people not to hate us, you got to set a good example. And she said, you know, that sounds reasonable, I'll get back to you. So she got back to me 10 minutes later, she said, you're off the show, we're canceling the segment. So I said, okay, I don't need that Shirley Chisholm poster, I don't, you know. They said, no, it's off. So meanwhile, we had sent out a mass emailing through the Center for the Study of Political Graphics, saying, you know, watch for Carol on the Bill Rosendahl show, blah, 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 the time and this, everything. So then we had to send out another email saying, you know, and I didn't say anything about censorship. I was so stunned. I was so shocked. I just said, you know, basically announcing to people that I wasn't going to be on. I didn't give any reason. Well, we started getting all kinds of email. How come? And one of the people we got was from a press person. And he was a friend, not a close friend, but an acquaintance. And so I told him the whole story. He said, is it okay with you if we make this public? I said, fine with me, I don't care. So he did, and all of a sudden I started getting calls from the press. And then Bill Rosendahl got calls from the press, and he lied. He said, oh, no, we're just postponing it. She wasn't canceled, she was just postponed, which was not what I was told. But he was embarrassed, he was publicly embarrassed into inviting me back on. So he's prepared and I'm prepared. It's kind of like the standoff, right? The high noon on cable TV. And so they told me to send posters I want, to send 20 posters, and they would choose which posters I could use. So I said, fine, 2 can play this game. I sent 20 of the strongest posters that we have. Let them pick any of them. I was fine. No more of that green ecology, you know. Everyone was U.S. beats everybody in genocide records or the ilk. So their normal format was, it was an hour program. They had 4 speakers, 4 guests. Each guest got 15 minutes. So my 15 minutes starts, and Bill Rosendahl takes 5 of it to give his definitions of patriotism, which were great, but he was basically covering his butt, because patriotism includes dissent, and he was including some, you know, major figures. I don't know if it was Thomas Jefferson or who said that, but clearly he was. So he spent the first 5 minutes of, okay. Then, after my first 5 minutes, he said, okay, thank you very much. And I refused to leave. But I did. I did leave before my full time was up. But that was really, you know, that was a really kind of, it was scary. It made me angry, and I felt really powerless, because you know, it's fighting the people who have the ability to pull the plug. And if it hadn't been for the press in that case embarrassing Bill into letting me back on, I wouldn't have been on. And then the last time was, then we did an exhibit. Nancy Buchanan, an artist you may know of, she and I did an exhibit in the spring of 2002 called Show the Flag. And it was all basically posters that showed the US flag since Vietnam War to the present. And I got invited to speak about that show on Life and Times that no longer exists, but it was a KCET, public broadcasting show that dealt with local, local LA, Southern California issues.